Hello to our friends joining us via recording. Today is April 28th. We are wrapping up our review for exam number 4. Friendly reminder that exam 4 is open until midnight tomorrow night, Wednesday. So do make sure to get that exam wrapped up. The two things we said we wanted to talk about today are hearing and equilibrium. So my friends here in class, help me out. What page is this picture in your notes? What page is this picture found in the lesson 13 packet? Where are we at with this one? Okay, I'm seeing page 11. Okay, so we're on page 11 of that packet. Page 11 is your best bet for figuring out how the process of hearing works. Because it goes through step by step and shows you the structures. It also outlines for you, I can see here on the right, outlines for you some of the things that are happening. So when you're doing that question on the homework that asks you to put stuff in order, this is a great page to help you with doing that. So as we talk about the process of hearing, let's do a little bit of general review here. The process of hearing is a special sense. We talked yesterday about the cranial nerves that helped with each of the special senses. Who can remind me which cranial nerve helps us with the special sense of hearing? What cranial nerve helps me to do this? Oh, nice. Deepa typed the whole name for us. Look at you. Okay, so the number on it is number 8, cranial nerve 8. Put the normal number 2. When we talk about the process of hearing, this is the nerve with the big long name that we typed. So vestibulo, but then it has the second half of its name, cochlear. Cochlear. The cochlear part of its name comes from its role in hearing, because the place in your ear where you actually hear sounds is inside the inner ear. The inner ear is called the cochlea. So the very middle tube of the cochlea is called the cochlear duct. The cochlear duct is where sound waves go, where my special hair cells are that assist with the process of hearing. So cochlear duct here in the very middle of the ear. This is where sounds are perceived, and they send their information to the vestibulocochlear nerve. Sound waves start in the environment, though. There's a structure that we can't see out here. It's the big elephant ear structure here on the outside. Can anyone help me out? What's the name of the big elephant ear structure on the outside? Yeah, so that big structure that we can't see on this picture, that first starts with sound waves, is called the auricle. And the job of the auricle is to collect sound waves. So my auricle is where I first collect them. Think of it kind of like a funnel. It sends them into this structure, this tube that we see right here. This was a lab bone marking. The lab bone marking is called, I won't make you type that one because that one's really long. External acoustic meatus. The external acoustic meatus. These two structures, we have 3 areas or 3 regions to the ear. These two structures, the auricle and the external acoustic meatus. What is the name of this region of the ear that includes the auricle and the external acoustic meatus? What's the name of that part? Yeah, so a couple of us are chiming in. These structures that we're looking at are called the external ear. The external ear. This is the stuff on the outside. When we talk about the external ear, it ends at the first structure they have right here. So the external ear ends at this structure called the tympanic membrane. The tympanic membrane, so here's a nerd moment with Dr. Allis. In addition to being a science nerd, I was also in band, so I was a band nerd too, and I did percussion. because I couldn't make the flute make a sound when I tried, but I could hit a drum. So when we talk about this thing called the tympanic membrane, we have this instrument called a timpani, which is just a really big drum. So you have in your ear what normal people call the eardrum. So the eardrum right here is this tympanic membrane. Sound waves that we collected with the auricle, that we bounced around in the tube called the external acoustic meatus, are going to bump up against this tympanic membrane here. That causes the tympanic membrane to start vibrating. So the first part of your ear that gets sound waves is called the external ear. The external ear includes the auricle, the external acoustic meatus, and it ends here at the tympanic membrane. On the other side of the tympanic membrane, then we go into this section of the ear. This section of the ear is called the middle ear. The middle ear. The middle ear is the location of some little things called the ossicles. And the ossicles are the smallest bones in your body. There are 3 of them. One of them is called the malleus, which its name means mallet, like you'd use to play a timpani. So that one's attached to the eardrum. The malleus is attached to a little one called the incus, and the incus is attached to the stapes. Stapes means that it's a stirrup, like you'd put your foot in when you're riding a horse. So here's the stirrup over here. Sound waves vibrate through the malleus, into the incus, into the stapes, and that vibration then gets transferred over into this internal ear region called the cochlea, where we perceive it. Hey, can you guys tell from the picture, when I look at the middle ear right here, what is the middle ear usually supposed to be filled with? Can we tell? What might we have here? Yeah, the middle ear is supposed to be an air-filled space. It's supposed to be an air-filled space. Now, I point that out because, and I think we talked about this in office hours last week, we have a condition in the body called otitis. See if I can spell it right. Otitis media. This is a fancy word for a middle ear infection. Normally, this part of your ear is supposed to be filled with air. If you have otitis media, if you have an ear infection, this area will actually fill up with pus and bacteria, and it's really painful because what ends up happening is it puts pressure on this eardrum and actually makes the eardrum kind of bulge out. So if this area is filled up with fluid, that's an ear infection. Yeah, so Carrie's asking if that's what normally happens in children. Yes, it is. Otitis media and ear infection is when they get pus and bacteria that's living up here. We mentioned the reason that kids get ear infections more than adults. There's this little tube that goes down here. This tube actually goes down into the back of your throat. We're really grateful for this tube because when we go on an airplane, which who knows when we'll do that again, right? Next time you go flying in 3 years, this tube is helpful for you because you swallow and it equalizes the pressure in your ear. So this is an air-filled tube that we use to keep the pressure inside the middle ear equal to what's going on outside. Except the bacteria that live in your nose and live in your throat can find that tube too and climb up it. And in kids, instead of this tube angling down, this tube actually angles to the side more. It's a little bit more horizontal. Until their skull grows a little bit taller as part of the normal development, this tube is a little bit more straight across. So instead of having to fight gravity to climb up into the middle ear, it can just go sideways and go straight into that middle ear region. So the middle ear region is supposed to be filled with air. The only thing we're supposed to find inside there are these ossicles, these little bones. But it is possible for this area to fill up, and it's very painful if it fills up with an ear infection. So sound waves, back to what we were actually talking about, right? Sound waves come from the external ear. Yeah, I don't know what to say, Hannah. Sorry guys, give me just a minute. Okay, so sound waves went from the external ear through this air-filled middle ear. At this point, once we go from the middle ear into the internal ear, now we're floating around inside fluid. So by the time we hit this internal ear region of the ear, we're now inside fluid. There are two types of fluid that we have inside. The first type of fluid is the one that we see in our top tube up here. That type of fluid that we see in the top tube is a type of fluid called perilymph fluid. The type of fluid that we see inside our middle tube called the cochlear duct is called endolymph fluid. And we'll talk more about those fluids here on the next slide. But the two fluids, once we hit these fluid-filled areas, now my sound waves are really close to being heard. In scala vestibuli, the first fluid-filled tube that sound waves come into, we don't hear them. They start vibrating around back and forth inside this tube here. But when we find the place on the cochlear duct where they can be heard, where the hair cells that live inside of there are prepared to listen to their vibrations, it'll sneak inside the cochlear duct, we'll hear it, and once we've heard it, we get rid of it down in my bottom tube that I see down here. So the bottom tube is called scala tympani. And remember that we said scala tympani is where sounds go to die. So when I've heard a sound, I send it here to scala tympani. Those sound waves, we see them being recycled down here. We're trying to get them out of the fluid. They end up at this structure here at the end called the round window. The round window releases those sounds back into the air, and because there's nothing to catch them, I can't hear them anymore. We mentioned in office hours when we were talking about this before, we want to make sure we know the difference between the oval window and the round window. The oval window and the round window, one of them, the oval window, is where sounds first get into the cochlea. So this is where they're first going to be sent so that we can hear them. The round window is where sounds go when I'm recycling them, when I'm done with them. So the oval window, make sure you know that that one's the beginning of the internal ear. The round window, that's the one that's the end of the internal ear. This is actually the very last structure in the process of hearing when I get rid of those sounds at the round window. So the question is, different locations on the cochlear duct have passageways for different frequencies. You can kind of think about it that way. If you remember from, so I'm gonna back up here to another picture here. Back up to our discussion of sound waves. Remember that different types of sound waves travel at different speeds. So sound waves that are very low pitched, so think of someone with a really low pitched voice, those travel more slowly. Sound waves that are really high pitched are going to travel a lot more quickly. So the vibration rate, maybe don't think of it as a passageway as much as like, are you moving at the right speed to sneak inside? So if you are a really high-pitched sound, I can hear you up at the very beginning of my cochlear duct because you can sneak inside the little moving doors, if you will, to get into the cochlear duct. So maybe the best way to think about it is the doors open and close, they revolve at different rates. When you find the speed that matches your speed, then you can sneak inside the door and now you're in the cochlear duct. So consider it something like that. Whatever helps you to remember that different pitches of sounds are heard at different places. We go along our, let me go back here, along our cochlear duct. If you're going really fast, you can sneak into the cochlear duct up here. If you're going really slow, we sneak into the cochlear duct down closer to this direction. Yeah, and that's absolutely right, Deepa. I like the connection between the R's. Thinking about the round window as the recycling window. I like that a lot. That's a good one. So here's the big picture process of sound. So a couple of things to make sure we know from this picture. We want to make sure that we know the difference between the internal, middle, and external parts of the ear, know where those structures are. and know how to put them in order. So use this picture as your guide. You know that I am always a fan of you guys making flowcharts. So flowcharts of putting stuff in order, that's a great way to study this. Starting with that auricle that we talked about, the big elephant ear on the outside, tracing it all the way through this round window here at the end. If you can make yourself a flowchart like that, you can absolutely ace that question on the homework because you've got a flowchart in front of you that shows you right away. So big picture, here's how hearing works. My next picture that we look at, remember we talked about where this picture came from. So on the last page, we saw the cochlea that's all spread out. Remember we said in office hours, I've got the spread out cochlea. I took a knife, I chopped it in half, and then I rotated my cochlea around. So we're looking at those three tubes. This was the top tube, this was the middle tube, this is the bottom tube. These three tubes that I see right here are the same ones that I saw before. So the first tube that sound waves go into when they're coming into the internal ear is scala vestibuli. Let's see if we can remember. Scala vestibuli is attached to one of my windows. Which window was at the beginning of scala vestibuli? Remember, scala vestibuli is the first tube that sound waves go into. Yeah, so a few of us are chiming in here. This is connected to the oval window. Connected to the oval window. So sound waves first come in through the oval window. They start to vibrate around inside scala vestibuli. That's my top tube here, scala vestibuli. When they vibrated through this top tube and they find the right place, they'll go into the cochlear duct. That's the middle tube. But I want to point out really fast that when I'm done hearing them, remember I send them into scala tympani to get rid of them. What's the name of the window that scala tympani is connected to? Who's scala tympani connected to? Connected to the round window. Connected to the round window. So two windows, the window that lets things in, the oval window, the window that lets things out, the round window. What page are we on? Probably 11 or page 12. Does that sound right for my friends who have the notes packets out? Yeah, we're moved on to page 12 now. So we're looking at our tubes here. Oval window where the sounds came in. Cochlear duct where I heard the sounds, all the way out to the round window where I spit them out. Here's where those fluids come into play. Remember, we had two types of fluids inside the internal ear. We had perilymph fluid and endolymph fluid. And again, we talked about these in office hours, so I'm going to ask my friends to help me out here. Endolymph fluid has a lot of two things. Who can remember the two ions that endolymph has a lot of? Yes, yeah, the first thing endolymph has a whole lot of is potassium. Potassium. The job of potassium inside the cochlear duct is what I'm going to use to help me with the process of depolarizing my hair cell, with making my cells send a message. So the first thing that endolymph has a lot of is potassium. The second thing it has a lot of is calcium. Calcium. And we talked about in office hours how the job of calcium in the process of hearing is just the same as the job of calcium in the process of neurons sending messages to each other. So neurons bring in a whole bunch of calcium, which causes them to spit out neurotransmitters. It's the same deal here with the cells that live in the cochlear duct. They bring in a whole lot of calcium, which causes them to spit out neurotransmitters so that we can perceive that we're hearing things. So the fluid that lives inside here has a lot of potassium and it has a lot of calcium. Both of these two cations, there's our lecture review for us from Unit 1, both of these positively charged ions are involved in helping my hair cells detect the process of sound waves. That's another underline highlight star for us. The cells that do hearing are called hair cells. Hey, there are a couple of other senses that use hair cells. Help me out. What are some of the other types of senses that we've talked about that use hair cells? Yeah, so olfaction, my sense of smell, they have hair cells. Gustation, the process of taste, gustatory hair cells. Gloria's chiming in with balance. Yep, so equilibrium and balance, those are our special senses. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge, that there's only one special sense that doesn't use some kind of hair cells. What's the one kind of special sense that doesn't use hair cells? Yeah, exactly. A bunch of us are chiming in. It's the special sense of vision. Vision doesn't use hair cells. Vision uses two other kinds of cells. What are the names of the two types of cells that do vision? We talked about them briefly, I think, yesterday. Yeah, the rods and the cones. Rods and the cones. So we want to make sure that we know for our exam this week and for the final exam that the only special sense that doesn't use hair cells is vision. And instead, they use the rods and cones. I think I saw a question. Let me go back up. Ashley asked, so in general on the final exam, calcium has the main job of spitting out neurotransmitters, yeah, or of causing our neuron to spit out neurotransmitters. That's correct. When we think about calcium entering a neuron, that's the reason calcium comes in, to make those neurotransmitters spit out. So that's true of a regular neuron, and that's true of these hair cells that we're talking about as well. So that is correct. Okay, the way the process of hearing works. We've got two membranes here, tectorial membrane and basilar membrane. Help me out here. When I talk about the process of hearing, one of these membranes moves. Is it the tectorial membrane or the basilar membrane that moves when I'm hearing things? Yeah, awesome. Lots of us are remembering the part of my cochlear duct that moves when I'm doing the process of hearing is the basilar membrane, the basement membrane. Now, I'll mention for some terminology. It was mentioned in the guided lesson, but it's also here in my picture. What I'm looking at, let me get my pointer back. What I'm looking at right here, so I've zoomed in really close inside that cochlear duct. What I'm looking at right here is what we call the spiral organ. So the spiral organ is all the parts that I use to directly help me hear. So this is the nervous tissue inside the cochlear duct. So the spiral organ has this basement membrane. Yeah, it's also called the organ of Corti, correct. We have this running joke in the biology department. If there's a way that we can name something that's not an old dead white guy, we generally go by that name. So we're going to call it the spiral organ as opposed to organ of Corti. Corti would be really offended that we're not using his name, but we're going to use spiral organ is what I'm going to use. So here's my spiral organ overall. I see it here. The bottom of it is called the basilar membrane. The basilar membrane is the membrane that bounces up and down with those sound waves. So sound waves come in and cause this membrane to bounce up and down. And on top of that membrane are those hair cells, my cells that are detecting information, my sound waves. They start bouncing because they're attached to the basilar membrane. They start bouncing with the basilar membrane, except this tectorial membrane, this thing up here on top, does not bounce with them. So think about the tectorial membrane like a tent, maybe, or it's like the roof on this structure here. The tectorial membrane stays in place. So when these cells start bouncing, they're little hairs that it's kind of hard to see in my picture here, but they're little hairs on the top bump into the tectorial membrane. And depending on the way that they bump into the membrane, depending on how fast they bump into the membrane, that's going to dictate how much these cells respond to a sound wave. So this is a good picture to show us what the spiral organ looks like in more detail. When we go to this picture, there's not as many details here, but we do still see the same labels. So we can still see that basilar membrane, that thing on the bottom that we said moved. We can still see the tectorial membrane. That's the membrane on the top that does not move. And we can see our hair cells that are here in the middle. So when we asked about talking about the process of hearing, I'm pretty sure this was probably the place that we were most interested in talking about. So we'll spend the most time here talking about the process of hearing. The cells that are involved in hearing, like we already talked about, are those hair cells. Sticking out on top of the hair cells are all of these little hairs. My hairs have a type of gated channel on them. How do I open up the gates, or what kind of gate channels live on the outside of these hairs? Which kind of channels are here? Yes. The channels here are mechanically gated channels. Mechanically gated channels. When my channel is mechanically gated, how do I get it open? How do I get those to open up for us? Mechanically gated channels, yes, these are the ones like your backyard gate. We ought to push them open. Pushed open. We have to push them open. When I want to open mechanically gated channels, the way I'm going to open them is the tectorial membrane pressing on them. So when the basilar membrane is, here's my label here, at rest, meaning when you're not actively hearing a sound, the basilar membrane sits flat, it's not moving, we're waiting to hear something. The way that we described it in the lesson is that when you're just waiting to hear a sound, a few of those hairs are touching the tectorial membrane. They're not bumping into it, they're not pressing against it, they're just kind of touching it just a little bit. By touching it just a little bit, notice how we have a label here that a few of those mechanically gated channels are open. So not very many of them, but a few of those channels are sitting open just by the fact that we're touching that membrane. If a few of those channels are open, we change the charge on my membrane, we slightly depolarize it, like it says here. Now, hair cells work a little bit differently than neurons do. In regular neurons, remember, we had to get all the way up to +30 to let inside our calcium ions. Hair cells are willing to do a little bit more of, you might call it a graded approach, meaning that if I open up a few of my potassium channels, I can let in a little bit of calcium. So I let in a little bit of calcium, which makes me spit out a little bit of neurotransmitters. That's what I see down here, spitting out a little bit of neurotransmitters. When I spit out just a little bit of those neurotransmitters, that's going to cause me to send a few messages. I can see these two little lines down here, a couple of action potentials or a couple of messages. So when you are waiting to hear a sound, when you're listening for a sound, we have a little bit of pressure, just a slight bit of pressure up here that opens up a few of my mechanically gated channels, which brings in a little bit of potassium. I bring in a little bit of potassium, which means I also bring in a little bit of calcium, and that's going to allow me to send a few messages. Remember, we talked about in office hours last week that when I release a few messages, I'm basically sending a ping out to my brain, telling my brain, we're not really hearing anything, but we're waiting to hear something. So when you haven't heard a sound, when your basilar membrane is at rest, we send a few messages to the brain to tell the brain, nothing to hear yet. We're waiting to hear something. All of changes when we start to hear a sound. So this middle image here is when we're hearing something. When we're hearing something. When we hear something, check out that basilar membrane down here now. Now the basilar membrane is bending in such a way that it pushes this hair cell up close to the tectorial membrane. When I push it up close to the tectorial membrane, all of my mechanically gated channels open up. Instead of over here, we had just a few, right? Over here, we opened all the channels. So all of this potassium is rushing inside, which causes all of the calcium to rush inside, which causes all the neurotransmitters, look at all of these guys, to get spit out. When I release all kinds of neurotransmitters, we generate a ton of signals, like I see right here. So when you're hearing a sound, when you're actively perceiving something, our nerve is lighting up like crazy. It's getting all kinds of messages telling it that we're hearing something. That's because the direction that this membrane is bending is pushing my hair cells toward the tectorial membrane. So when you're at rest, the hair cell just barely touches that membrane, opens a few gates. When we're hearing something, all of my gates are pressed open. But remember that once you hear a sound, we get rid of that sound. We push it away. Hey, let's remind ourselves, what's the name of the tube? I'll give you the scala word. You don't have to type scala. What's the name of the scala that I send messages into to get rid of them? When I'm getting rid of messages, that's what's going on in this last frame here. What tube am I trying to send those sounds to? Yeah, this is when I'm sending them into that tube called scala tympani. So I'm going to put a note here. This is recycling sounds. We'll call this recycling sounds. Or in other words, we could say done hearing. Done hearing. When I'm done hearing, I took those sound waves that were inside the cochlear duct and bending my basilar membrane section. Now I'm transferring them down into scala tympani. And when I transfer them down into scala tympani, that actually bends my membrane the other direction. So now you can see my membrane's tilted up the other direction. Because I tilted the other direction, now notice that my hairs are pressing against the tectorial membrane again, but they're pressing against it in such a way that it closes my ion channels. So basically we're pushing the doors shut now because my membrane is tilted the other direction. When I push those gates shut, now I can't let any potassium in. If I can't let any potassium in, then I can't let any calcium in. And if there's no calcium coming in, there's no neurotransmitters going out. See, when you're done hearing a sound, we stop releasing any messages down to our nerve because we need to let the nerve know not that, oh, we're waiting and listening for something, not that we're hearing something. We need a third state that says, okay, I just finished hearing something. There's nothing new to hear. That's this last one here. So my last frame shows me when we just finished hearing something, the way that we let our brain know that the sound we were hearing is gone is we stop sending any messages. And very shortly after that, my membrane is going to go flat again, and we'll go back to sending out these little pings that tell the brain we're listening for a new sound. But here's the way that we tell our brain we don't hear anything anymore. We stop sending a message to tell them that this crazy message you just heard is completely done. I need to know what questions we still have about this particular process, this part of the hearing process. What questions we have, or you can give me a thumbs up, or we can have a little dance party. What do we want to know about this here? Okay, getting a lot of emojis. Let me see if I can draw you a little penguin. The little penguins always look worse than the big ones. Here's our daily penguin. Ashley asked if sodium ions are involved in this process. Sodium ions are not involved in this process. That's a good compare and contrast compared to the way that normal neurons work. The reason that we used sodium ions when we were talking about normal neurons is because outside normal neurons, we have so much sodium that's floating around, right, in our extracellular fluids. Well, the extracellular fluid around these hair cells here, we said it's not that it has a lot of sodium, it's that it has a lot of potassium. So The reason that I use potassium to depolarize my membrane is just because it's what I have. Yeah, so Mary Lou's saying the crash course guide mentions sodium. I'm pretty sure too, if you look at the comments, several people have corrected that. So for the sake of our understanding, we are assuming that it's about potassium. So we're using potassium to depolarize these guys. Oh no, I don't expect you to have read the comments, Mary Lou. I was just saying what sometime, you know, I'm the nerd, remember, the nerd teacher. So I go through and I go through and I read the comments sometimes, and it's really funny what people say. So yeah, we're going to stick with potassium because potassium is what I have so much inside in my endolymph fluid. Oh, well, thank you, Mary Lou and Carrie. I appreciate that. I appreciate that I am a source for you. I'm glad you like the penguin every time I draw it. Maybe we'll get another penguin in at the end of class today. Okay, so when we talk about, here's a big idea that we said with hearing and with equilibrium. We said that the process of hearing is all about does anyone know what word we put in all caps after this? The blank of neurotransmitter release. Does anyone remember what word? Yeah, there we go. The rate of neurotransmitter release. At the end of the day, this is what it comes down to. How quickly are you spitting out neurotransmitters? Are you spitting out just a few because we got a few ion channels open and I'm releasing just a few? Are we sending out a ton because I'm hearing a message and we need to know that? Am I sending out no neurotransmitters because we just finished hearing a message? The process of hearing is all about the rate or how quickly I spit out my neurotransmitters. So keep that in mind. Hey, let's review. We did this yesterday. The process of vision requires that light waves get focused on the where. Where do light waves have to go to? To the retina, exactly. Light waves have to go to the retina. If we learn nothing else about vision, right? Here's what we got to know. Light waves got to focus on the retina. If we learn nothing else about hearing, I mean, again, I hope we learn more than that, but if we learn nothing else about hearing, we should know that it comes down to how quickly I'm releasing neurotransmitters, the rate of neurotransmitter release. So that's true for the process of hearing. That is also true for our processes of equilibrium. So we're going to dive straight into equilibrium. Help me out here. I'll give you a second to find it in your notes. The picture that I'm looking at right here, which kind of equilibrium am I looking at in this picture right here? Is this dynamic equilibrium or static equilibrium? Yes, several of us chiming in. This picture shows me static equilibrium. That's correct, Carrie. The process of hearing is all about the rate that I release those neurotransmitters. Man, I told you guys that I was better, and I am. I feel so much better. But that little bit of crud in the throat is like, we're going to hold on forever. Like, we're going to just stick around. So sorry for the coughs. All right, static equilibrium. Static equilibrium is the one that helps you out when you bend your head forward or backward. Forward or backwards. Technically, when we talk about static equilibrium, this is equilibrium related to gravity. So think about it as the ways that gravity pulls on your head. It pulls your head forward, it pulls your head backwards. Or the silly example that we did in office hours, right? I told you guys this is the two ways that students fall asleep in class. So you either fall asleep with your head going down, or if you're really exhausted, you fall asleep with your head going backwards, right? We totally pass out. So static equilibrium is about forwards and backwards. Must know, underline, highlight, star, must know these little rocks right here. because they're my favorite. I really like them. What are these little rocks up here called? Do you guys remember what we called these things? Yeah, so a couple of us are chiming in. These little rocks that are involved in the process of static equilibrium, these guys are called otoliths. And I do love the otoliths just because it's funny to me to think about having rocks in my ears. So these little crystals that are involved in the process of static equilibrium are called otoliths. Otoliths are what actually move when your head goes forward or when your head goes backwards. So we can see in our picture here, there's three states that can be going on with your head. Your head can be upright, meaning it's not bending forward, it's not bending backwards. Your head could be bending forward. We're falling asleep forward facing in class. Or my head's bending backwards because I'm completely passed out. That's what we see here in the last frame. In each of these situations, it's all about what happens with my little rocks, with my otoliths. So the otoliths sit on top of what's called the otolithic membrane. Remember, we had a discussion in office hours. This is a lot like Jell-O. So I got this Jell-O membrane that has little rocks on top of it. And the cells that actually do hearing, or balance, excuse me, they also do hearing. These guys right here, same kind of cells that do hearing, excuse me. These are my hair cells. And my hair cells have big long hairs that stick out of them into this Jell-O membrane. My hair cells are covered in mechanically gated ion channels. Just like last time, they're still covered in mechanically gated channels. So these little rocks sit on top of the membrane and basically are sitting on top of these hairs. Depending on where the rocks are located, they're going to open a moderate number of channels. That's what I see going on here. Remember the word we kind of gave for when your head is upright? We called it slow and steady for my rate of neurotransmitter release. We're just sending out constant little pings that tells your brain, ooh, watch those mics. Sending out constant little pings here that tell our brain that our head is upright. We could also be sending out a ton of neurotransmitters. That's what I see right here. I send out a ton of neurotransmitters when my head bends forward. When my rocks start getting pulled this direction, that opens up all of those mechanically gated channels that I see inside here. I send out far fewer messages. See how my rate of messages went down? When I start bending backwards, when those rocks start to close some of those mechanically gated channels. So just like we saw with the process of hearing, it's all about the rate of neurotransmitter release. So we had slow and steady for when my head is upright. We have all the messages when my head is bending forward. And we would say that we have very few, I'll put that in caps, very few messages when my head bends backwards. So again, it's our phrase from before, static equilibrium is all about the rate of neurotransmitter release. That rate comes down to what are my rocks doing to my hair cells? Are they pushing open some of those channels to give me the slow and steady signals? Are they pushing open all of the channels, so I spit out all of the signals? Or are they pushing some of those channels closed, so I send out very few of those action potentials? Just to be sure, this is all about hair cells in the ear, is the question. Yes, we are talking about hair cells in the ear. I should clarify, well, we're not talking about all of the hair cells right now. Help me out in the chat. We do static equilibrium with which parts of the ear? Which parts of the ear help me out with static equilibrium? Static equilibrium is done in, yes, the utricle and the saccule. The utricle and the saccule. These particular images are showing me what happens in the utricle and the saccule. The images we were looking at before, by the way, with the process of hearing, what was the name of the specific place that we do the process of hearing? Where do I do hearing at? It's not the utricle and the saccule. What part of the internal ear? Yeah, inside the cochlea. Yeah, specifically the cochlear duct, that middle part. But the process of hearing is done in the cochlea. That in general terms, it's done in the cochlea. Specifically, the part of the cochlea is that middle tube called the cochlear duct. More specifically, that middle tube. Both of these places, though, well, I guess all three of them, technically, the utricle and the saccule and the cochlea, they all have hair cells. The ability for us to do static equilibrium, the ability for us to do hearing, is all about the rate of neurotransmitter release. That is the same. But these particular pictures we're looking at are only true. This only applies when we're talking about static equilibrium. So I'm pretty sure there's a sorting question on your assignment that asks you about what's involved in static equilibrium. We use hair cells to do static equilibrium, but we also use things like the otoliths. Yeah, and Ashley's asking for us here. Let me back up one slide here. All of these hair cells that are working together, and they're supporting cells that keep them alive, all of those live inside a membrane called the macula. So if I wanted to give a name to all of this right here is called the macula. All of that is the macula. So I've got those hair cells that we talked about. I've got their jello membrane. I've got those little rocks on top. Because not everywhere inside the saccule and the utricle can do this balance stuff. It's just the parts that look like this. So the name for all of this is the macula. Has those hair cells, has that membrane on top of it. We've got those little otoliths, those little crystals that are inside. So if we're making a list here, static equilibrium is going to have things like the macula. It's going to have things like the hair cells, things like the otoliths, the otolithic membrane. I think those are the main ones here. Hey, remind me, by the way, with static equilibrium, which cranial nerve are we talking about to do static equilibrium? Which cranial nerve does static equilibrium? Do you remember? Yeah, so Ariel chimed in for me. This is cranial nerve number 8. Still cranial nerve number 8. Number 8 helped me out with hearing, right? It also helps me out with balance. The first part of its name is vestibulo. Now we're talking about the balance part, the vestibulo part. So balance and hearing, the two things that cranial nerve number 8 does for me. The vestibulo part that goes to the saccule and the utricle that we see up here. It also goes to these things here called the semicircular canals, which we'll talk about. All of those things work together to help me out with balance. That's the vestibulo part of its name. We have a question, static equilibrium being impacted by frequency or only by motion? That's a great question. I don't know the answer for sure. My guess would be that it should just be motion that impacts this process, because when we talk about frequencies, about sounds, they're going straight into the cochlea. They should not be going into this area here inside the ear. So my guess of the answer to your question, Trinity, is that no, frequencies should not be having an impact on this because they should be going out here to the cochlea instead. The question is there a difference between what happens in the utricle and the saccule, or does it happen at the same time? It happens at the same time, Pilar, and that's actually a great question, because while one of these sacs is oriented kind of one direction, the other one's oriented a slightly different direction. So we use the utricle and the saccule. Both of them are detecting what's going on. So one of them might read that, hey, in my chamber, my rocks are going straight up and down. The other one might read in their chamber that technically their rocks are bending forward, but because one of them is oriented maybe more like this, and one of them is oriented more like this, let's use a Unit 3 word here. Your brain integrates the position of those rocks, of those otoliths, to figure out which of these scenarios we're looking at with our head. So they aren't exactly the same. Their position isn't exactly the same. The way they work is generally the same. We're using the information that both of them collect to help us to know which way our head is oriented. So yeah, great question. They detect things the same way. They're not quite at the same angle, but the brain is going to use the information it gets from both to help it out with that. Yeah, the brain is awesome, right? Fun fact, there is this book out there called Inside Your Outside. If any of you have kids, this is a really fun book. It's a cat in the hat book. I got it for my daughter because I was like, this looks like the kind of thing that I would enjoy, therefore she will enjoy it. And actually she does, because she's a nerd like me. But there's this little book here called Inside Your Outside. And they talk about processes that your body does, and they talk a little about the process of balance. They talk more about what we're getting ready to talk about with dynamic equilibrium. But one of the things that the book says is that the brain is so smart, it does millions of things that computers can't do. That's kind of what made me think of that, Pilar, when you were talking about the brain being so smart. Like, made me think of that book, because there's several things. I'm actually very pleased with it. For the most part, it is anatomically accurate, which is not easy to find. But yeah, so if you have kids, I think it's like $6 on Amazon. Oh, it's out of stock on Amazon. Oh no, see, I just plugged for it and it's out of stock. Well, put it on your wish list, because my daughter really enjoys it. Inside Your Outside. So that's a good thing to consider buying for your kids. Because like I said, it's mostly anatomically correct. The thing that bugs me the most about it is they say that we have soft bones in our nose. It's like, that's definitely not soft bones. That's definitely called cartilage. But other than that, I'm pretty pleased with it. So yeah, do buy it for yourself, Gloria. It's awesome. So Inside Your Outside, a cat in the hat book that has brought my daughter great joy, and also put her to sleep times, because it's a long book, but we like it. So okay, let me make sure that, yes, so Ashley asked, is this what's going wrong when you have vertigo? This is one of the things that can be malfunctioning when you have vertigo, yes. It can be a static equilibrium issue. It can also be a dynamic equilibrium issue as well. So vertigo in general is going to come down to either the saccule and the utricle having some issues, or the semicircular canals having some issues, or both of them. Just generally the balance parts of the ear having some issues for you. What if that was our AMP1 book? Carrie asked about Inside Your Outside. You know, I've thought about, I would love to do a project where I have my students go through and like critique books like that. So I need to build up my my repertoire of books that are like that. Inside Your Outside. There is actually also on Amazon a book literally called Anatomy for Babies. And some of my colleagues from TCC bought it for me. So I haven't read it yet to see if it's accurate. But I would love to like just do a silly project that like we literally go through and critique children's books. Like, I would love that. That'd be so much fun. The question about fall being online, we're probably not going to know that. The final word on that, honestly, June, I think, would be the earliest that we're going to hear, unfortunately. So, oh, that one's on stock. There you go. So, yeah, and maybe I'll have to pull out, I can show you guys in office hours next Monday, I can show you those books, because I do have copies of them now. So, Okay, now that we're done with that tangent, tangents are fun, right? We gotta break up the monotony of this social distancing stuff, right? So last thing that we said we wanted to talk about for sure was dynamic equilibrium. So we're now looking at the structures of dynamic equilibrium. Dynamic equilibrium is rotational equilibrium. Rotational equilibrium. When we are detecting rotational equilibrium, this is done in the structures called the semicircular canals. And if you notice in my picture here, I have one that sticks up. I have one that's more to the side, one that sticks out to the side. Each of these semicircular canals all works the same general way. But again, it's going to be like we were talking about with the saccule and the utricle. Your brain is going to integrate the information from each semicircular canal. Each semicircular canal. So while one of them might say that in this direction, in the upright direction, we're not rotating, another one might say, well, in this direction, I'm rotating a little bit, and the one behind it says, oh, we're rotating a ton. Your brain is going to integrate that kind of information to figure out overall what your body's doing. Each of these semicircular canals use a nervous tissue structure called the crista. So Ashley pointed out for us, the utricle and the saccule have that nervous tissue structure called the macula. When we're inside the semicircular canals, we have a structure called the crista. But just like inside the utricle and the saccule, and just like in the spiral organ, we have hair cells inside the crista. So hair cells with their hairs that I can see here all sticking up. These hair cells also have mechanically gated channels. These mechanically gated channels get pushed open when the membrane on top of them, called the cupula, kind of looks like a little fire, right? Got a little fire sitting here on top. When this little cupula fire moves back and forth, that presses on the mechanically gated ion channels on top of these hairs and allows those to open up and allows us to hear. Hey, by the way, check this out. Fluid inside the semicircular canals is endolymph. Remind me again, because it's the best way to study. What does endolymph have a bunch of? Endolymph has a lot of, it's always the same answers. Yep, it's always potassium and it's always calcium. So when you're thinking about how these hair cells detect balance sensations, they're using potassium and they're using calcium. Hey, I didn't highlight it before, but a good thing for you to keep in mind and maybe make a note of for yourself, the utricle and the saccule are also filled with endolymph. Utricle, saccule, semicircular canals, and the cochlear duct. All of the places that send their information through that vestibulocochlear nerve, they all use endolymph. They're all using endolymph to do that. Remember, you know how much Dr. Allis likes her compare and contrast, right? So endolymph fluid is involved in balance and hearing. I've got to have that fluid for balance and hearing. Yeah, Carrie's like, also known as on the exams. Yeah, I like to do a lot of compare and contrast. So endolymph, something that's there inside the semicircular canals, the saccule, and the utricle. The process of dynamic equilibrium, again, we'll make our little note here. Dynamic equilibrium is based on the rate that neurotransmitters are released. We're back to the rate. So normal situation, my cupula is standing straight up. That's that little tongue of fire on the top here. It's standing straight up. a few of my ion channels are open, I'm sending a few messages to my nerve to let my brain know that this particular canal, there's no rotation going on here. We're good. When I start twirling, like we see this ice skater doing here, the fluid inside our semicircular canals starts to move. That fluid is moving along with the cupula. The cupula is getting bent by that fluid. When I bend it, I send out a whole bunch of signals to let my brain know that we're bending. The cupula is bending this direction, aka your brain knows that means that we're rotating this particular direction. When you stop rotating, the fluid, so the structures inside your ear, those hair cells and the cupula, they stop moving because they're anchored in place in your body, but it feels like that fluid is still moving. So for a while, when you're really dizzy, when you stop spinning, it's because the fluid inside your ears now feels like it's going the other direction, because we used to be moving with it. We were spinning the same way with it, and at some point it stops, feeling like it's pushing. When it starts to feel like it's going the other direction, that slams those mechanically gated channels closed, and it helps you to know I've stopped spinning, although it makes me feel really wobbly and dizzy, right? So until this fluid slows down and stops moving, until it finally catches up with the fact that we're not spinning anymore, you will be detecting the sensation or feeling like you're not balanced, like you're off base. So the question is, there's a cupula in each of the 3 semicircular canals. That is correct, yes. So each of your semicircular canals has a cupula inside of it, and depending on its exact orientation, for one of those canals, particular spinning movement where her head is upright and she's just spinning in a circle, that'll make a couple of those canals go nuts, and one of them be like, it's not a big deal. If she turns her head sideways and starts doing, because the Olympics are coming up eventually, right? If she does the whole thing, I apologize, it's going to look real terrible, where she lifts up her leg, right? And then she puts her ice skate up here. Let me draw her a little ice skate. Look at this. I'm telling you, I missed my calling. Art teacher here. And then she bends backwards. So she bends her body backwards and her head goes here. And she's rotating, holding onto her ice skate. Her arm comes out of her head, apparently. If her head is now at an angle as opposed to just upright, like I see right here, that might activate a different semicircular canal to this extent. So each of the semicircular canals is each detecting this. They each have their own cupula. They're each bending at different rates. And again, your brain is doing, my favorite word of the day apparently, integration. Integration, where it takes the information from each of those 3 to figure out exactly what's going on with our rotation. What other questions do we have about static or dynamic equilibrium? What other questions do we have? Or give me a thumbs up. We can have a little emoji fest here. What are we thinking? The beach, yes. Yeah, so picture number 1, we are not rotating. Technically in picture number 3, we're also not rotating. We've just stopped rotating. So that's why we can see that the cupula is still bent. It's just bent in the opposite direction because we've just stopped rotating. So yes, when we're in the state of we haven't rotated for a while, we're just standing straight up. The hair cells, what are they doing? A few of their mechanically gated channels are open, which means that a few neurotransmitters are being released in this one here. They're just chilling out, waiting to be bent, essentially, is what's going on with those. So does this work less well as you age? That's a great question. I don't know for sure, but with what we talked about with the lens, what the lens is getting harder in your eye. I would be interested to think about, I wonder if the cupula gets harder too, maybe? I don't know. That's a great question though. Yeah, children seem to have incredibly high tolerance for spinning like this, right? And then as we age, it starts to not be so fun. So That's a great question, Ashley, that I don't know the answer to. Maybe it works less well as we get older. So in picture number 3, there is no neurotransmitter release, is the other question we have. Yes. We're going to assume it's the same way. So we have a normal, slow and steady neurotransmitter here when our head is upright. We have a very high rate of neurotransmitter release when we're spinning. And when we stop spinning, we have a very low rate or a no rate of neurotransmitter release. That's correct. When we stop spinning. Yes, you're welcome. Any other questions about this? Yeah, I'm eyeing that beach emoji that you sent, Kathleen. Yesterday I took a little bit of personal time and printed a few pictures. We have a photo printer, so I printed some of those maternity pictures I told you guys about. And then my daughter has a little flip book of pictures, so she can go through and look at them and not have to be on our phones to look at them. Just a little over a year ago, we were in Florida. And so it was really fun to look at some of our beach pictures from Florida and think, like, when are we ever going to get back to the beach? Like, man, I think all of you guys would probably agree. We could really use a beach vacation right about now, right? Like, I think we've all earned a beach vacation. We should just all pack up and go. Yeah, or a road trip. Yeah, we could do that. A road trip would be safer than flying on a plane, man. I know, we didn't really get to have a baby moon, alas. Yeah, that was a little sad. But when you got another kid at home, the baby moon thing doesn't usually happen. So, or at least not like it did with the first. Although ironic, here's a fun fact. Back when I had my daughter was the age of Zika virus. You guys all remember that big hubbub. So we were pregnant with my daughter and we're thinking about going to Florida before we had her. And it was like, well, we're definitely not going to Florida where there's Zika virus. So we actually had a really awesome time in Las Vegas. So we went to Las Vegas and stayed at like a resort outside of the Strip. So that was a lot of fun to be a little bit away from it all. But then we got to go see a Cirque du Soleil show. We did very little gambling because I realized that my tolerance for losing money is very, very low. So we played like the cheap machines where the max bet is like $2, and I still was always like, oh my gosh, like I cannot bet $2 on one roll on a slot. Like I was so not made for gambling. It was really funny. But yes, yeah, I know my pregnancies have been poorly timed in that regard. Let's just say that. Yeah. Okay. I've covered everything that you guys mentioned yesterday. Are there other topics we want to hit on today as we wrap up our time together? We got a little bit of time left. Are there specific questions? Are there general questions? Or do we just want to have another emoji dance party and we can call it good? Here, let me pull up a whiteboard really fast. Let's mention a couple of things. Exam number 4 must be done by tomorrow. Tomorrow is Wednesday. Had to remind myself. Wednesday at 11:59 p.m. But remember, I always tell you guys, don't plan to do it right up at the deadline. Please try to plan to get it done by like 11:30. Makes me feel better. 11:30 p.m. tomorrow. On this exam, it's like last time where the questions come one at a time. However, this time we're not going to be able to go back and look at answers. I had several, like go back and change answers. I had several issues with students where when they tried to go back to a question to answer it, it kicked them out of the test. So for each question on the exam, make sure to answer each question as it appears. There's no backtracking like we had. It's the same format that it was like we had on the lab final exam. I'm trying to remember, I believe, someone correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we've got 60 minutes on this exam. Does that sound right? 60 minutes on the exam. I believe there are 40 or 45 questions. I apologize, I can't remember for sure. 40 or 45 questions, somewhere in there. So you do have over a minute on each question. Take the time that you need. If a question, as we talked about if we were doing it in class, question causes you to, it's blowing your mind, you're losing your head, don't spend more than like max 2 minutes on a question. If you stared at for 2 minutes, you don't know the answer, pick your best guess, call it good and move on. Because there's plenty of other questions for you to work on. There's plenty of other questions you know the answer to right away. So give it some time, but don't let it sidetrack you and get stuck. Let me see. There's a comment. Yeah, so Pilar, I mentioned earlier in the office hours today, I checked my answer key. That question is not incorrect. The key for accessory and visual structures is correct. Make sure you're selecting all of the accessory structures. If you don't select all of them, you don't get full credit. If you select something that is a visual structure, you lose credit. So go back and check that. That is the list that you put in for me is not all of the accessory structures of the eyeball. So check that out. There are multiple of them. And we talked about that yesterday in office hours too. Toward the end, we went through and outlined accessory versus visual. Here's the other thing. Let's talk something fun really fast. Okay. Last office hours. That is next Monday. Next Monday. Let me get the date for us. That's the 4th. Next Monday, May 4th. So we joked about this, but I decided that like legit, we're totally going to do this. For our last office hours together next Monday, we will be reviewing for the final exam. We're going to start reviewing for the final starting on Thursday. So bring your questions Thursday, Friday, next Monday, reviewing for the final exam. But what I also want you to bring on Monday is I want you to bring a glass of something. So my something is, oh, that's awesome. That's true. May the 4th. I like that. Okay. Want you to bring a glass of something. I don't care if it's wine. I don't care if it's bubbly. I'm going to have my husband get me some cran grape juice. I want you to get a glass of something because at the very end of our last office hours together, we are literally going to raise a glass together. So do a little bit of makeup. Like, I would love to see you on the webcam for just a brief moment because literally I want us all to raise a glass together. So next Monday on May the 4th, plan to attend. At the very end of our office hours, we're going to raise a glass together because by golly, we've earned it, right? And there will be no judgment. I don't care what's in your glass. We will, yeah, you can drink your wine at the beginning, right? That's totally fine too. But I would just love to share that little moment with you guys at the end of our office hours next Monday. So to my friends in the recording, plan to try to make it next Monday, May 4th. Yeah, it'll be 5 o'clock somewhere, and by golly, we are going to take advantage of that. Let's raise a glass together. So that's all I got for today. I will probably go ahead and turn off the recording. I'll stick around for a bit if we have other questions. Please try to take exam number 4 today, just in the off chance that there's some technical issues. Want to make sure we have time to address those. So try to take it today, but again, not tonight when the thunderstorms are blowing through. It's technically due by tomorrow. Other deadlines too, I guess I should outline this really fast. Friday, current events, can't spell. Current events in anatomy is due Friday night. You can submit up to 4 of those to get some extra credits. Sunday, Group Wiki is due. That has questions related to the final exam. So I need you guys to be working with your groups to wrap those up Sunday night. Final exam goes live Monday, May 4th, may the 4th be with you. Monday, May 4th at 7:30 a.m. must be done by Tuesday, May 5 at 11:59 p.m. So that's our big dates here. Trinity asked how much the extra credit ones are worth. So for current events in anatomy, draw a line here. First submission, the one that everyone has to do at least one, is 10 points. 2, 3, and 4 are all worth 5 points each, which means that you could get a total of 25 points out of 10 points on that assignment. That is a lot of extra credit right there. So do it. Do it, because that's 15 points of extra credit in that category. That's the same category as your homework assignments. It's going to make a difference in your grade. So definitely worthwhile for you. The question is, will you be pulling some of the same questions from past tests for the final exam? Generally, my policy is no. I generally make up an entirely new exam because I'm crazy like that. Same concepts. You have your list of learning objectives. Honestly, there's only so many questions I can ask about certain things, like the fluids in the body. Like, you know how I have my favorite graph with those fluids, right? I can only ask you so many ways. What do I find outside the cell? What do I find inside the cell? So you will see some questions that are very similar to what you've seen before, but it probably will be a new set of questions. So a new pool of questions that I get to start writing tomorrow. I'm gonna need to raise my glass on May 4th because I've got a busy weekend ahead of me. Let's see. One question about the submission of current events. So I do one article and I submit, another article and submit, so on and so forth. That's correct. So start by reading one article, make that submission as thorough as possible, put that in the Dropbox, and then you'll go through. Remember, if we're doing extra submissions, we're trying to find an article that relates to each of the different units. So there's a list for you of the tags you'd use for each of the units. So unit 1, for example, one of the tags that you'd find on an article is things like cells. Unit is going to be things like bones, the skin, that kind of stuff. So you want to submit something from each of those units. All of your submissions go in the same Dropbox, and I will grade them all from the same place. So 4 different articles that you'll be summarizing like that. You're welcome, Letty. Yeah, I definitely want to give you guys a chance to get some extra credit points in there. I know that it's been a rough transition to online, so here's your chance to up that grade. I submit 4 at one time. Does this mean I'm doing it the wrong way? If your submission, so if you mean you submitted 4 different documents all at the same time, that's fine. Or if you copied the template, okay, yeah, that's perfect. Yep, so they should all be in there. And if you want to send me an email to remind me to check, just to make sure I can see all 4 of them, that's totally fine too. Yeah, so we just want to make sure that we get 4 submissions in there. They can all go in on the same day at the same time, or they can go in a couple today, 1 tomorrow, 1 Friday. I don't care. So just submit them in there for me. Well, so if you're afraid of, so it's the question says, I'm afraid that if I submit and I have no way to do it again because it's done. Yeah, so if you have specific questions about how to do the assignment, shoot me an email with specific questions about it, about how to do that assignment. Yeah, if it's a question of you downloaded the template and then you're having trouble uploading it again, those kind of things, you can save the template as one name and then save the work that you did, like Deepa's mentioning there. Save it as a draft, submit it, and then go back and edit it and save it again. Or you can go through and download the template multiple times. But again, if you have questions about how to do the assignment, send me those specific questions via email, And I'd be happy to try to kind of talk you through it. It's not supposed to be a super hard assignment. I want to know for sure that I can see that you read the article. I want to know for sure that you have seen specific facts from our class that relate to it. If I can tell that from what you submitted, you should be in good shape. This is not designed to be a trip you up and be hard assignment like that. Yeah, and you guys are welcome for the extra credits. What percent of the grade did Anatomy for Babies end up being? You would have to check the ICR in WebAdvisor. I want to say it ended up being 5%. Okay, 7.5. Mary Lou is saying it's 7.5% of the course grade. To compare, I believe the assignments category, which is where these points are going into, I think the assignments category got bumped up to 15%. Okay, yeah, so Mary Lou says it was 10% before when we were doing 4 submissions. It's down to 7.5%. The assignments category grew because we started to have a lot more assignments. And so the category in the grade book where your extra credit is going in now is not the Anatomy for Babies category. It's the assignments category that is worth more points than the Anatomy for Babies category is. Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to turn off that recording and I will stick around for other questions. Goodbye to my friends on the recording, and please plan to be here on May 4th. We'll have our little virtual raise a glass party together. So have a great day. Good luck on the test.